Yeah, that's true. I mean, it was never really discussed, and it's not that surprising because, nobody really knew who they were at that time, and, you know, and then there was so the flyer said, "Sonic Youth needs a drummer," and Thurston also mentions that in the, fanzine store, see here, someone crossed out drummer and said, "Sonic Youth needs ideas."
I asked partially just because it's like a funny thing and it may be somewhat surreal just to like find out this like this very pivotal thing in your life so many years later, just by reading this memoir of somebody you know.
Yeah, it's funny because, and also, like, reading Thurston's book, um, you know, I knew we were, like, around the same time, but I didn't realize, like, how many things we had gone to that we had in common, like the Public Image riot at the Ritz and then Kraftwerk at the Ritz and the 42nd Street, the Times Square art show, and then, of course, the New York New Wave art show out in PS1. There was, like, so many things that we had both gone to before we ever knew each other.
You were in a you were in a band for a while. These weren't things that just like came up at any point.
Um, they might have, but I don't really remember that. But, you know, I mean, it makes sense. It's just kind of like, when I first met them to audition, the first thing Thurston said was, "Oh, I've seen you around."
You actually grew up fairly close to the city, right?
Yeah, Clifton, it's like 10 miles out of the city. So even as a young kid, my parents would take me into the city. I mean, I remember walking down 42nd Street with my father, like, when I was a little kid in, like, the '60s or whatever. Yeah, so
Just to go real far back, and this is an interesting part of your history. Father was a Heisman Trophy winner.
yes, he is. He, won the Heisman Trophy in 1943. I think he was actually the 3rd person to win it and the first one for Notre Dame.
Was there a pressure for you to be like a jock to kind of follow in those footsteps?
No, not at all, because I was, the youngest of 4 kids, and, I was, like, 5 years difference to my next sibling, and so, by that point, I don't know. No, I never felt any pressure at all, and my father was a really great guy, and, you know, luckily that didn't happen, and I didn't fall into it anyway because I was, in the '60s, I was totally into the counterculture, and while the football games were getting played in the living room, I was in my bedroom with headphones on, getting stoned or whatever, you know?
Yeah, I've got one older sister, and it's this funny thing that seems to happen from people who are from like larger families who have more siblings. By the time they get like 3 or 4 in, they're like, that one they'll take care of themselves.
Yeah. Yeah. So,
And this is I don't know, this obviously this is like one of those. I mean, this is like as much of a kind of American cultural touchstone as like existed in the 20th century. But you were another one of those Beatles Sullivan kids.
yeah. I was 8 years old, and, it was a big deal 'cause, and at the time, I was, like, in Catholic school, and, the nuns the same night that the Beatles were debuting on Ed Sullivan, there was, like, a Leonard Bernstein special on another channel, and the nuns were, like, saying, "You have to watch this, you can't watch that," and, and I remember my older brother told me that when he was in the same, grade school that when Elvis was on Ed Sullivan and he was, like, doing, from the waist up, the nuns actually told him, like, "If you watch that, it's like a mortal sin."
Yeah, that's really funny. I'm curious, like like as an 8-year-old, like leading up into that moment, like what had you heard about them? What was your knowledge of the Beatles specifically up till that point?
Well, everyone had the AM radio with the top 40, and I don't know, I guess it was just kinda hyped up because everyone was talking about it even before it happened, and then when it happened, it was such a mind-blowing thing, and I just wanna, like, venture off a little bit 'cause, it's funny because I'm actually DJing this Thursday, at a show of, Vicky Peterson and her husband, John Cowsill, and, I've become friendly with John, and I watched the, Cowsill's documentary, um, that was made in 2011, and I didn't know the whole story, but, I just find it very cool that I can now say that I'm friends with someone that was on the Ed Sullivan Show.
I don't know. I mean, I know the name obviously, but I don't know
Okay,
that much about them.
The Cowsills were a family band, and they were the inspiration for the Partridge Family, but
Okay.
the Cowsills were the real deal, and they were like, you know, John Cowsill was like, he was like my age, so he was like 8 years old playing the drums on Ed Sullivan, and, it turned out to be a weird story because they were huge and they sold millions of records, but they got totally ripped off. I don't know if it was by a manager or their father or whatever, and then a couple of them died and, but we're not here to talk about the Cowsills, we're here
No, I know.
to
I mean, this is interesting. I mean, like, but it also it sounds like he turned out to be like a relatively normal guy, which is not always the case when thrust into the spotlight at 8 years
Yeah,
old.
he was a drummer for the Beach Boys for many years, and now he's married to Vicky Peterson of the Bangles.
It's a pretty good. It's a pretty
Yeah,
good life. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
totally.
So he came on after, I guess, after Dennis drowned. He was that
Oh, yeah,
replacement, or
well, probably
yeah,
many years after.
many years later. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um. So so you were in Catholic grade school. Excuse me. So you were in Catholic school, uh, 10 miles outside of the city, which like it's kind of frustrating, right? Because you're like close enough, that you're like within reach, but it sounds like at the same time you're also in this just entirely different world.
Yeah, but I totally rebelled. I hated Catholic school, and when I was in the 8th grade, I, begged my parents to take me out and put me in public school, and, it's a story that's in my book, actually. So, my mother didn't know what to do, so she went to the principal, who was this, you know, nun, and one day I was sitting in class, and the nun pulled me out of the class into the hallway, and as she was slapping my face back and forth, she said, "Why would you ever wanna go to public school?"
She gave you the Chinatown treatment.
Yeah, she sent me on the path that I'm still on, I guess.
Yeah, God, that's wild. Did you have an answer? Or, I mean, was like you slapping me in the face
No,
right now?
I just stopped doing schoolwork until they did, and then I went into 8th grade at a public school, and I was so happy to, because I was really into, like, being, like, wearing cool clothes and seeing women that look more like the Shangri-Las and the Ronettes than, you know, Little Miss Goody Two-Shoes.
Again, it sounds like you went from Catholic school into public school, and then even from there, like you still continue to rebel a little bit, right? I mean, I was reading somewhere
Well,
you describing this kind of breakdown of the jocks and the greasers, and you were in the
yeah,
latter
yeah,
camp.
yeah. It was that kind of world back then, and then, so during this through the '60s, I was becoming a hippie, and I was 14 in 1969, and that's when I started, like, experimenting with acid and smoking weed, and, um, and then when I was in high school, that was while I was in high school was, like, when Ziggy Stardust came out and Lou Reed's Transformer, and, I got more into counterculture and Roxy Music and all this stuff, and I started going to clubs in New York. I went to see the New York Dolls at Max's Kansas City in, like, 1973, and then I discovered CBGBs in 1975, and I just started going there like 4 nights a week and just, seeing the beginning of all those bands.
A lot of what I'm pulling from right now is from a bio around the album, and I noticed that it was written by Glenn Morrow, which is that's a great connection too. That's a great guy to have right here.
Yeah, well, we kinda wrote it together, and it's kind of funny. I mean, not to, it's just like I actually said to him at one point because it was just so long because I've done all this stuff and, and and so, at one point I said to Glenn, I'm like, "Man, probably most of the bios you write, you have to pad, and with mine, we have to, like, get rid of stuff."
You're like, I've got a book in here, and
Yeah.
we have to turn it into one page. But he's kind of similarly situated as you are, and as a musician who also has this writing career as well.
Yeah, I kind of fell into being a musician accidentally, and then, yeah, then in the '90s, me and my wife put out the BB Gun magazine, and so that, got me into writing more and interviewing people and stuff like that, and that's what actually got me to take a lot of photos, and now I have this archive of cool photos and working on a photo book that's coming out later in the year, and and I just had a photo show in Hoboken during the summer, and I mean, I have a few more in different places.
If I'm kind of detecting a through line between your creative endeavors, it sounds like to a certain extent you fell into each one of them. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely. Yeah. And it continues on with this, solo record I have coming out, So a lot of the interviews are just like,
Yeah.
they're just like, "Oh, it took you forever, and now you finally," it's like, it was never even a thought in my mind, it just kinda happened.
It's another interesting piece, again, pulling from the bio that you and Glenn wrote together. But another interesting piece is that that you were playing the drums as a kid, that you left and then ultimately came back to it.
Yeah, because, after seeing the Beatles and seeing the British invasion happening, and I took a liking to the drums, so I took lessons for a year when I was 12, and, I had a little drum set in the basement that drove my family crazy, and then, you know, and then but once I even, had some jam sessions with kids and but once I moved out of my house at age 18, that was the farthest thing from my mind, and, I was more interesting in pursuing fine art, and, so, yeah, there's the story goes, and, I when I met my wife, she lived in Jersey City, and I lived in New York City, and we compromised and moved together in Hoboken, where I still am, and, so, that's where, just for such a long time, I lived within a block or 2 of Maxwell's. So I spent half my life there, of course, that's where I met Glenn and everyone else. But, so, while when I first moved to Hoboken, I was at a show and one of the half the band didn't show up, so someone said, "Hey, is there a drummer here?" And Linda's like, "Yeah, Bob is." And I got up on stage and that turned into my first band. And then, I enjoyed doing it and I just never stopped.
There's something about that Maxwell scene, as we're talking about you, as we're talking about Glenn, and like, obviously when I think about Maxwell's, like Yo La Tengo is kind of the first name that really like jumps to mind, where it's these musicians who are also like really, really deep music nerds at the same time.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that rules me out because 'cause I'm not like those guys. I my knowledge and my record collection is limited. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you see, obviously, like you've been writing about it for a while. I mean, you seem to, and an interesting piece of your bio is that I know you had written that you had done an interview for one of the suicide reissues. So, like, I
Yeah.
mean, you've got some depth of knowledge, certainly.
Well, totally, but, you know, unlike say Ira or Glenn, I started writing after I was in a band. It wasn't like, I was like a music fanatic that, started a band and, I was just like, even when I rode the train with Ira in Georgia like a week or two ago and just, the knowledge that they have is just, kind of mind blowing.
Speaking of suicide, I had uh, God, maybe like a month or two, Adele Bertai was on the show because she had a book come out, and I know
I
that
just
the
read
two
her
of you,
book. Great.
yeah, yeah, and obviously of the no wave scene, and I know that you two know each other, but she, in there in that book, she's talking, she talks a bit about going to the Suicide show and what an impact that they had on her.
Well, the same with Lydia Lunch. They were the first thing she
Yeah,
saw, and they, were giving her vitamins and things, and now she tours all around the world doing suicide songs, you know?
yeah.
So
Did they similarly? I mean, did it have a similar effect on you?
I first saw suicide. It's funny because I first saw Suicide opening for the Ramones,
Mm,
and it
that's quite a bill. Like that. That's a very kind of that's a spectrum.
yeah, well, first saw the Cramps opening for the Ramones too, but,
Okay, that's a little bit closer, I think,
yeah.
right? Musically, yeah,
But anyway, it was just like and I was with my buddies and everyone that I was with was just like, "Take this off, it's torture," they were hating it, and they stayed on a really long time, and when I interviewed them for, the liner notes, I was telling Alan about that show, and he said, "I remember that show. It was like the Ramones were, opening for Blue Oyster Cult at Nassau Coliseum, and they were really late getting back. And every time we tried to get off the stage, Hilly made us go back on. And, so it was just like extra long, loud, piercing drones."
it is a funny thing. I mean, that's kind of similar to like learning about this again pivotal thing about your own life, like by reading Thurston's book so many decades later. That just like so much of what we would consider like lore, or so much of these things that were like formative experiences for people are just a product of like schedules being of these other just completely unrelated things.
Yeah. And, Suicide was just so ahead of their time.
You moved to the city with the expectation of becoming a fine artist?
I, being obsessed with Andy Warhol and the factory scene when I
Mm.
was in high school, when I got out, I took a bunch of night classes at the School of Visual Arts and I learned how to silkscreen print, among other things. So
Oh,
then I
okay.
got a job um, as a fine art silkscreen printer, and and that was like 1978, and that's when I moved to Manhattan, and I had a illegal apartment on 7th Ave and 23rd Street, and it was only like $115 a month or something like that. But eventually, got kicked out. But um, yeah, so you know, that's why I was there, and that got me involved with being closer to everything, and then my next job as a fine art silkscreen printer was in Soho, which was great at that time because you'd go on your lunch break and you'd like go see a Rauschenberg show and there's like 6 groovy record stores all around, all these art galleries, and, um, and so in 1979, I, saw a little ad in the back of the Village Voice for a punk rock art wanted. So I took my piece down to this gallery, which was on Wooster Street down the block,
Mm.
and they accepted it, and I was part of this group show with like Joey Ramone and all these people, which was like for me at that time was like, oh man, this is it, and that's I stayed connected to that gallery, and that's where I met Linda, and that's and also when I was working there at the same silkscreen printing place, that's when someone I work with came in and showed me the No New York album, which I immediately connected with and started like following every single person that was had their mugshot on the back cover, you know. And so um and that's kind of like, I there was never a thought of being a musician or joining a band until maybe after that record came out, when I realized you didn't have to be a technical genius and just have a great idea. And, so I ended, going to see all those bands and, becoming, being a big fan of that. And it's funny because, I ended up in recent times from 2012 to like 2023, playing with Lydia Lunch and, touring the world, playing her music, um, you know, history. And whenever, whenever Lydia introduces me to somebody, she says, Bob has seen me perform live more than any other human. I saw Eight Eye Spy and I just everything she did, and then, I actually met her the very first show that I played with Sonic Youth, which was at CBGB's on I'll look up at the poster, November 3rd, 1982. And, and that's when I met her at that show. And, it was the total thing where, people say don't meet your heroes, but, meeting her was like, I'm still close friends with her now. So,
Yeah, and that was it was like it was fairly accessible, at least at the time, right? I mean, she wasn't like necessarily on a different level.
oh, no, but, you know, but she,
Yeah, but yeah, yeah. I'm curious. It's interesting to hear you describe the No New York album that way because this is a bit before my time, but when I hear people talk about specifically punk, like the first wave of punk, this liberating idea of not having to be you know um, a super technical musician and being able to form a band like like the Ramones, right? They're the classic example of that. Um, but for you, it sounds like that no wave was what you connected with, and I'm curious, like
well,
why?
especially as becoming a participant because,
Yeah,
I would go see all these bands and I would see people like, Clem Burke or Jerry Nolan or, JD Dart, like all these drummers were just like amazing. And I was like, I could never do that, and I still can't. But, so that kind of like, made it so like, this is a possibility, or I don't know why, but that's and and it's funny because in one of the documentaries, it might be the Lydia Lunch documentary, and Carlo McCormick was talking about it, and he goes, with the punks, it was no future, and with the no wave, it was no present.
listening to your stuff and listening, on this new album, listening to a lot of these covers of very familiar songs. Um, I would describe your style as being like primitive. I mean, is that a fair assessment?
Sure, I describe it as that all the time.
Yeah, yeah. And that's but it is something that I mean, as you said, like you're not like a super technically proficient drummer, but obviously it's something that that has been able to propel a lot of different bands and a lot of different musicians. I mean, there's something about that kind of drumming that is still very powerful.
Yeah, I mean, Bad Moon Rising was the first full album I ever played on, and I'm still, it's still being talked about to this day. And I mean, what a way to start, I guess. But yeah, and then as I got, as time went on, the more you play, the better you get. And you, playing that metal drum kit and Pussy Galore, and that was like, and we would play like, 30 songs, like one into the other, and I listen to it, I listen to it now, and I'm like, man, how did I ever do that? And
Did you? I mean, were you just like, were you totally wrecked by the end of the night?
totally erect.
Well,
Some nights,
yeah. No, was
some
I?
nights after the show, I might have been totally erect. Yeah, no, it's just, a lot of sweat because not only was it
Yeah,
high energy music, but hitting a metal plate doesn't have the give
it doesn't have give. Yeah.
that a snare drummer Tom has. And so yeah, I mean, my arms were pretty big back then.
I've never done silk screening, but I've heard this from silk screeners that you also have to have like pretty good upper body strength to do silk screening.
Well, not only that, you have to like, that was one thing. You I wore a mask a lot of times, but Andy Warhol's most of his prints were really big, and so I mean, we had the thing with the handle. It wasn't like dragging it,
Yeah.
although sometimes we did. But, the more than just the hard work on your arms is just, like, breathing in all those fumes. I felt so much better after I left that occupation.
So wait, so I think I missed that the first second because I know you had said that the factory were an influence, but you were actually this screen printing work that you were doing Warhols at the time.
Oh, yeah, I did Andy Warhol's artwork up until he died. I was printing his editions and his paintings and stuff, and this is, like, in the '80s while I was in Sonic Youth and Pussy Galore.
That's an incredible That's an incredible part of the story to just sort of like that we just kind of skipped over. That's
Isn't
fascinating
that
because
in
you
the press kit?
uh I'll have to go back and look, but no, I mean it's well because as you said, like this huge influence on you, the factory, I assume like the velvets and everything else in there, but that you were able to that you went to SVA and you were able to make that connection pretty quickly, it sounds like.
Yeah, it's really funny because before I knew any of them, and when I was part of that art gallery, I was in a group show, and I made a flyer for the show, and it was a collage of different stuff. And in the collage, there was Lydia Lunch and Andy Warhol, and I ended up working for both of them. Pretty crazy.
How was Andy as a boss?
I never saw him. He wasn't my boss. I worked for his right hand man, and we did all his artwork. But I never really saw him. I answered the phone a couple times when he called, and my friend Matt Verderay, who was later in the band Speedball Baby, he worked there too. That's where I met him, and he was a real good looking guy. So he was, he got to pick Andy up at the airport. All the queens were in love with him, so I just did the hard work.
I was going to ask you, and this transition into the no wave scene, but that what was that artwork? What was that piece that you had that was in that show with Joey Ramone?
It was a lithograph that I made at SVA, and it was a woman's body that I drew, and I superimposed Holly Woodlawn's head, which I photographed off the movie screen from the movie Trash. When I was in high school, one day I cut school and I went to see Andy Warhol's Trash at the 8th Street Cinema, and that movie changed my life.
Even without that element, it sounds like a very Warhol influenced piece, like a very like pop culture piece
Yeah.
in the way that a lot of his stuff was. Was that a through line with your work at the time?
Was that a what?
Was that was that a common theme with the work that you were doing, the artwork you were doing
No,
at the
but
time?
that's kinda influenced what I was doing. I did use, silkscreen in a lot of my artwork back then. I made a bunch of prints. Maybe you can see that one on the wall back uh, but, so, yeah, I was combining artwork and silkscreen, but not in the same way Andy did.
When you start drumming for on those Sonic Youth records, I mean, is it a situation where that just kind of ends up taking up, all of your time that you end up having to sort of drop the artwork and
Well, I still had to work back then, and, Sonic Youth, we rehearsed a lot. We rehearsed 3 times a week, and then, like, here I am in a band, like, a year before, it wasn't even a thought in my head, and now here I am in a van with Sonic Youth and Swans, like, going down on tour down south in, like, 1982, and, which was, crazy because it was, like, 10 of us in a van with a U-Haul attached with all the equipment, and I was the only one that didn't smoke cigarettes. It was like, it was crazy, and,
and I had Michael on the show. He's a very intense guy.
he was as intense as you think he is now. He was even more intense.
I'm sure. Yeah, I know he's like had kids and he's mellowed out a little bit. I can't imagine being in a van with him would be
Yeah, no,
probably
it
a
was
lot.
it was crazy. There was times when we were, like, in the van and him and Jonathan Cain were, like, throwing punches at each other, like, over the
That's gotta make you feel good about like your band experiences. You're like, as bad as those might have gotten at times, like at least we weren't like punching each other in the van, right?
Yeah, no, Sonic Youth always, they're well-adjusted, intelligent people. We always, everyone got along good. And, but yeah, no, it was crazy. And then, and then they, I don't know if you know the story, but then they fired me for a little bit, and, and then I came back and I went on their first tour to Europe, which was nuts because it was like, so the way the story goes was they replaced me with Jim Sclavunos for a little bit, and then he didn't work out, and then they had this show called the Speed Trials, which was this week-long festival in this art gallery, and it was like, The Fall, the 15-year-old Beastie Boys and, Lydia and all these bands, and so in the interval that I wasn't in Sonic Youth, I started practicing with other people, and my drumming really improved, so when I went back to rehearse with them, they were like, "Wow," blah, blah, blah. So we play the White Column show, and then the next day, Lee and Thurston are flying to Europe to tour with Glenn Branca, and while they were there, they're setting up the very first Sonic Youth tour. And so after I played the show, we went across the street to the bar, and they were saying like, "Will you come to Europe with us?" And I was like, "Under 2 conditions, A, it's not gonna cost me a penny, and B, you're not gonna fire me when we get back." And so, yeah, I mean, those first European tours were nuts. We didn't even have a van. We were traveling around with Eurail passes, like, passing, 13 beat up guitars through the windows of trains, and it was quite an experience, but it was great.
When you were traveling abroad, did it feel like they got what you were doing?
Oh, yeah. No, I mean, it was weird because just because the posters would say from New York City, it kinda gathered a crowd, and so no one knew what to expect. A lot of the audiences thought we were like a hardcore punk band or something, but we got a really great reception just because what we were doing was no one else was doing anything like it, and we were putting on great shows and, having a great time, and, it went over, small crowds, big crowds, they dug it, and, things started to grow as we went along.